Welcome once again to part two of the Eco-Sustainability Executive Overview, starting Preston Blevins.
To bring us up to speed, we covered so far the circumstance plus time, which really was intended to alert everyone that individuals will have different viewpoints, and you really need to get linked up together and in harmony about understanding. And I presume that everybody that's in this session at one point is going to be in a project team trying to implement or implementing a carbon reduction activity or a water usage activity. So knowing about those differences of view and trying to get in alignment with each other is important. The next part that we covered really were the catalysts for change, the history of all the systems and frameworks and methodologies that's been developed. And we went through that, and we could see that there were three distinct periods. One was driven primarily by the UN. There were a set of anomalies, positive anomalies that occurred, like SCORE, the GRI that occurred during that period, which was quite lengthy. Then there was another period where the business community took over and they developed a number of meaningful tools and methodologies and standards. For example, the GHG protocol, which we're going to get into in a minute, water footprint network, we'll get into in a minute, collaborating with ISO, all kinds of things happened that was really very positive. And the third period was the period where finance and investors got involved. And that is wound up with the development of SASB and all kinds of very positive things like TCFD, which deals with financial risk being stated and reports, the quarterly and annual reports of publicly traded companies. So we went through that, and now we're going onto the essential toolkit. And in our toolkit, we really only had three things to cover because those are foundational pieces. And first one was SCORE, and that we were then going to follow, and we will follow with the GHG protocol, and then end up on this particular part, the essential toolkit part, with the water footprint network. So let me just then move on, and we went through all of this, and we went through the orchestrate tools and the basic processes, and we quickly went over that. And right now, I believe that Sandy's going to send to everyone the URLs for how to get to these guides that are available on the ASCM website. So you should be getting that shortly so you can execute and wander through that. Now, I won't spend too much time on this because almost everybody that's in this session has been involved in some way, shape, or form with ASCM or Apex, its predecessor organization at some point. And SCORE is part of the IP of our intellectual property of ASCM. So I won't spend as much time on that as I would for other things. But I do want to make a point ending that discussion on SCORE. That is, we've had this real disaster with COVID when it came to disruption of supply chains. And the question that has been in my mind for a decade or longer is, can a business plan be viable without a SCORE analysis of critical supply chains? And by the way, supply chains are not only external, they're internal. And I believe that SCORE has its place as an input directly into a business plan. But I don't hear folks talking about that as a tool used, as the tool being used in that way, because it is a framework, it's a building block. It reveals things, it gives you the true picture, and it allows you to design supply chains and avert risk and increase your agility, etc. It also has application to sales and operations planning or integrated business planning. Yet, I'm sitting here saying, why aren't people talking about this as a key requirement to having a viable, useful, executable business plan? Sometimes it's just too pie in the sky in my mind. But again, the question I like to pose is, if SCORE had been widely adopted prior to the COVID period, that impact, could the impact of COVID on supply chains, on supply in general, have been mitigated or reduced substantially? And I believe, if I had to answer my own question, it would be yes. We would have had less problems, less disruption. In fact, had SCORE been widely adopted, we covered in the earlier part of the overview on it, 5,000 implementations of SCORE. But when you think about the number of companies in our economy in the US alone, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of companies. Many of them are in the small to medium size, but SCORE is adaptable enough and what I call Lego-like enough to be used by those companies. So if it had been implemented on a wide basis, I think we would have done many times better than the chaos that we found ourselves with. Okay. Throughout this, you'll see a lot of hyperlinks. And that will take you, when you get a PDF, after the course is completed, you'll get a PDF. And in the PDF, you will be able to go directly to the website of the company or the document. What I discovered after I approached it this way is that there would have been a better way to approach this had I actually directed you to our curated section. And the curated section, the benefit of that is everything is organized in it in a way where you get all the surrounding materials or complementary materials to a standard. Anything on carbon emissions, for example. And you would benefit from knowing that. In fact, I messed up because I strayed from what I said I would do in the beginning, which was show you through the website, and I didn't fully do that. So maybe at the end, I can turn it over to the pro, Sandy, and let him do that. But when you get your PDF, everything will be hot linked. All you have to do is bring it up on your computer and you can go look at all these good things. The GHG protocol is up next. And again, this is one of the essentials, and there's only 3 in my mind. And the first part about the protocol itself is it's a disciplined GHG accounting and planning methodology. They don't pretend to do science. What they're doing is they're collaborating with the science folks. In this case, I mentioned an organization that the UN has part of it, the IPCC. It's a science arm. What they've done is taken the science from IPCC and they organize something into a framework or a standard that looks very much like something an accountant would work with. And that probably is the reason why it's been so widely adopted and quickly adopted. Because in finance, it tends to be a little bit more conservative and resistant, yet there's been wide adoption of the GHG protocol. And I think it's because it looks familiar, feels familiar. But again, the science is coming from IPCC, not WRI, which is the owner of the GHG protocol. The other point is that it has really coverage in 3 major areas, which actually break out to be 5 areas. And the first one would be the enterprise itself. And by that, they mean anything that an organization owns and has full control over. They own that asset. It's their factories, it's their machinery, etc. They either have to have full ownership or full management authority over that asset. So that's scope 1, the enterprise. Scope 2 is the source of energy supply, basically electrical energy, sometimes steam, and our utilities that you have in San Diego. It's San Diego Gas and Electric, In LA, it's Edison, it's Pacific Gas and Electric in Northern California. It's every major city and town, and even little village has a utility supplier of electricity. That's scope 2. And that's important because most electricity 20 years ago was generated primarily by coal, with gas taking over as a cleaner source of energy or food stock to make electricity. And there was some nuclear, but scope 2 is very important because there's still lots of coal plants and lots of gas plants out there. The third part and the fourth part and the fifth part really is called scope 3, and it has three distinct areas. One is the supply chain itself, upstream, all inputs from your suppliers and services from your suppliers, anything that deals with distribution of the product after the owner enterprise, scope 1, is finished with it, but they have authority over, and also then the byproduct life cycle of a given product and its disposal. And that what that would mean by way of life cycle would be how much energy does the design of that product require to run? How long can that product last? And has it been designed for repair or parting out and reclaiming key materials for reuse? So that all is measured in scope 3. Other key things to really look at is that the GHG protocol is golden right now. It has been firmly established within the Global 500. It's a de facto standard, if not a real standard. It is a real standard. It's assumed that if you're going to do carbon inventorying and carbon reporting, it's based on the GHG protocol. It's very flexible. They have all the flexibility that accountants have. That's, again, they made everything look like, there's options if you have this situation, etc. They want baseline planning, baseline inventories. They want tight controls over it, so it's auditable. And the one thing that was critical in its acceptance, in addition to it being friendly and familiar to an accountant by way of its texture and structure, etc., was that it was collaborative with ISO. Remember, we went through that whole history of the development of all the tools that are support the battle against climate change. The other part is that its reports are often housed in the Carbon Disclosure Project database. We haven't covered that in detail, and we will shortly. But CDP was formed roughly about the time that the GHG protocol came out on scopes 1 and 2. And companies that were active in wanting to make sure that other companies that they dealt with and investors, institutional investors in cities and counties and states knew their GHG emissions profile. So CDP created an electronic database that was tightly managed and is very disciplined. And so all the GHG reports ultimately wind up in the CDP database. Here's a depiction of it that at first looks very confusing, and I'd like to break it down or maybe I can find the money or the time to figure out how to break this down to make it a little simpler than this, but it is comprehensive view of how these all interact together. In the end, when we say the GHG emissions, we're talking about the 6 emissions that you see up at the very top. It would be CO2, CH4, etc. Those are the GHG emissions that are being captured in their inventory, in the GHG protocol's inventory. That's what they want. CO2 is the form of presenting your inventory because it's the most abundant emission. It's the most abundant. It's not necessarily the most damaging, because what they've done is they have worked out the relationship of CO2 to CH4, methane, for example. And the IPCC, remember the science arm of the UN, has worked out the warming potential and the conversion into a carbon CO2 number. So you'll often see a report on the GHG emissions that a company makes. They'll often see the symbol CO2, and then there'll be a small e up to the right of it. That's the equivalent. But the two that seems to be the most abundant and problematic, all are problematic, would be the CO2, right here, CO2, because it's the most abundant, and also the methane, CH4. And methane is particularly volatile and problematic in that it really runs anywhere from about 50 to 30 times more potent over its life cycle. And so when you see CO2e, bear in mind that the equivalent the emissions for any of the other GHG types has been calculated and converted into a CO2 number. So that's really, I hope I'm clear there. Anybody have a question about that before I go on? I've never really attempted to explain that because I just understood it, but it occurred to me that it could be very confusing. And by the way, the life cycle of some of this is very important because later, understanding that later on, when we get to the Science-Based Projects Initiative, where there's a planning that has to take place out to the year 2050 with there being net zero emissions, there still will be emissions in the atmosphere because the life cycle of CO2, for example, could be in 100 years or more. But it starts to decay over time. Okay.
Hey,
Someone says,
Preston,
yeah,
we have a couple of articles in our curated website that get into the chemistry of carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and
right,
hydrofluorocarbons. And there's also an article that explains the difference between the biological CO2, which is not harmful, which we
right,
need to have in order to
right,
exist, and the CO2 that occurs when we burn fossil fuels. So everyone check out the curated website later on. Those
right.
articles are there.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to give you 5 minutes to do a run through of the
Oh,
website.
all right.
I goofed because I got all caught up and focused and I skipped, I intended to do that, but I only did part of it. So,
No worries.
okay. So bear in mind, life cycle is about 100 years. Most deadly of all for a short period of time is methane. CO2 is the most abundant. And when you see a number in a report, typically, some companies may break it out, but often you'll see a CO2e with a small e on the right-hand side, upper right-hand side, expressing that. So here's a depiction again. Here's your company, your scope 1 company. And that's all the assets that they have financial or management control over. Scope 2 is the utilities, energy, electricity typically. And again, that's important because, again, most of the power generation in North America and many parts of the world, particularly in PRC right now, they built a ton of coal-based power plants in the last 10 years. You inherit that, and we'll get into inheritance logic in a few minutes. So that's scope 2. Scope 3 is upstream inputs. And the most important of them, at least in my mind, are the things that are purchased and the capital goods that are related. And there's other things there, but they are minor in compared to these two. Capital goods being the things, the equipment, etc., and purchase parts or things. Those are, inventory going into you building a product as the buyer. So that's the upstream inputs. And then after the company makes its product, and I'll use the example of a product that's going to the end consumer, then the two most important things is what's part of scope 3 is the use of products sold. That would be the energy it takes for the life cycle of that product. Is it energy efficient, or is it poorly designed and really a dog when it comes to energy use? And then how the product is treated. Can it be repurposed? Can it be broken down into components, and many of that materials, the base materials, be recycled? So these two parts of scope 3 are called the value train. Okay, any questions about that? And it would be easier if I can figure out how to decompose this and redo this, bring in one at a time, and I'll try to do that in the future. So here's an example that I took out of the reporting standard. And here it shows that on the top is, let me move this a little bit here. What you can't see is my screen is partially blocked by all this stuff about the attendees. On the very right, you see the organizational boundaries. This is the way they speak of it. Organizational boundaries are the company. In this case, this parent company has 1, 2, 3, 4, company A, B, C, and D. Those are the organizational boundaries. And then below, on the right-hand side, they have a dotted line separating out the operational boundaries. So it's anything owned in buildings, the car fleet, leased factories, controlled by the buildings, any power generation units and their all the equipment inside the factories, any fleet of trucks or whatever the mobile devices are, could be forklift trucks, etc. So those are all operational boundaries. And in all cases, you're having these direct and indirect emissions. Oh, strikes again. The next part is a simple one that I did because the standards themselves published by the GHG protocol. Again, the owner is the World Resources Institute, WRI. It's even a non-accounting person, a person with little accounting background, can read through it and understand it. This was my attempt to kind of look at the accounting itself. The accounting deals with sites, the owners of the sites, the operations, the business processes, and the locations. In the reporting side, you have public reporting. The government will require it, or the investors will require that. In fact, we'll talk about on Tuesday about all the exchanges, trading exchanges like that are managed by the SEC. We'll talk about Europe, etc. It's mandatory in Europe for the GHG protocol results to be embedded in the quarterly and annual reports of publicly traded companies. Then you have government obligations where you have to report to, and also there's evolving or currently exists, but a more comprehensive emissions trading arrangement coming up soon called offsets. It's going to get more complicated. In fact, there's a new law based in California about the integrity of any offset that is sold and purchased to reduce the profile of a GHG profile of a company. We'll get into that in Tuesday. And here's another attempt by myself just to show, all the things that need to be considered. And if you look up at the left-hand side, the principles to be applied is just relevance, completeness, consistency, transparency, and accuracy. And in fact, if you ask the accountant, what should the balance sheet look like? What should all the reporting look like? You guess what they would say? It has to be relevant or material, complete, consistent, transparent, and accurate. So they're following the same regimen in the GHG protocol. In fact, the GHG protocol is insisted often that independent third-party auditors look at the inventory data and look at the reporting. And so it's quite stringent, but again, easily understood. In this case, we're just talking about up at the top, the protocol. Scope 1 is the reporting company. They're using the corporate standard from the GHG protocol. And in this case, they're looking at organizational boundaries and operational boundaries. All the things in dotted lines are covered in supplemental standards. Scope 3, for example, which would include which is value chain or supply chain. Any questions so far, or is this clear? Okay. Silence is endorsement. This is an example I put together, and I have a strong background and not as a metallurgist, but involved in things that have a metallurgical component. You know, I started out as a machinist trainee, and then I wound up a production inventory control manager, and then a manufacturing manager, and then a plant manager. But I always seem to wind up more often than not, even though I have experience with aerospace and defense and as a sector and electronics and food and all that, it wound up being at somewhere a big part of my life was dealing with products that were metallurgical in nature. So I use that as an example. Here's all the upstream inheritance logic of it. And if you're familiar with ERP and bills of material and costing, where you have a cost roll up through the bill, where you have the lowest level costs of a components, very low level components. They keep on rolling up to the next level, and everything accumulates. And it keeps on rolling up, rolling up, rolling up, and all of a sudden you wind up with a total cost in various categories for any end product or any level of a product, be it a sub-assembly or whatever the case may be. So everything is inherited. And what I've done down here as an example, and the GHG protocol and the water footprint network employs that. When we get to water, they sometimes refer to that as not only indirect inheritance, but they'll also use the word virtual inheritance. So right here, scope 1 in this example is this color. Scope 2 is yellow, and scope 3 is red. Now, extraction and mining, I just made a judgment call here that the company here wasn't buying electricity, they were buying raw materials because it's remote. So in this example, it's not reflected that they were buying they were buying energy directly from a supplier. They were making their own energy. They were buying materials to make energy, which would be scope 3, not 2. And again, the amount of each bar, by the way, is arbitrary on my part because this whole process is very energy intensive. A lot of GHG emissions occur in the making of a final machine part, for example. So here what we have is we have the extraction part, right? We're in a mine right here. And when we're all done, we ship it to a refining into a refining process, often done by a different kind of company. And so the total input of GHG emissions from extraction or mining is inherited before the refining company even does anything. As soon as it lands on their receiving dock, they own those GHG emissions is part of their ledger. And then they add processing to it. Some of it, scope 2, some of it is the actual scope 1. You can tell by the colors. And when they're all done, they move on and they get to the alloying of materials. Someone makes alloys. So, that is, an alloy is various metal types being put together and forming an alloy for a specific purpose. I actually my progression was I worked for a machine shop, investment casting, and then I worked for a company that made alloys. And I was hired by the company that made alloys because I did a great job of building a business system for the investment caster. But what happens there is you go through the refining and then you go through all these processing steps. So we got that when the alloying is done, it passes it on, and before anything's done by the machine shop, in this case, They already have a ledger. They haven't done anything. It just hit their receiving dock, right? They own that. And it's prorated, by the way, obviously to the part level or whatever that the form of the component takes. It could be bar stock of alloy or sheet stock of an alloy. So they inherit that and then they do their processing, etc., which includes probably scope it's 1 and 2, obviously. And then they go over to heat treatment and they go through the same thing. And finally, when it gets to the final customer, which could be I'm an aerospace and defense company. Now I have a turbine blade. It's made of Inconel and all kinds of stuff, and very precise. But that's the profile. That's what I have to report. That's well, what I have to report is that everything up to the point of my receiving it, or but when I receive it, I have to report also the scope 3. By the way, scope 3 emissions is estimated in it to constitute roughly 80% of the total emission count in a product. It depends on the industry, the vertical industry that you're talking about. You know, it could be ag, it could be aerospace and defense, it could be metal products, it could be plastic, whatever the case may be. It's 80% of the total of any one company. Could vary a little bit, could be 70, could be 90, depends. Retailers have it kind of rough because it's probably around 95%, 90% of their total scope 3. And scope 3 now is prior to the last couple of years, scope 1 and 2 became mandatory for the most part. Scope 3 was voluntary. Now scope 3 has become mandatory, and there's a mad scramble on because it's a very difficult thing to get that information. Mentioned earlier when I talked about this one firm called How Good that dealt with food ingredients. They are doing a great business because they spent 15 or 20 years using a multi-pronged process to come to a number based on a plot of land and the crop grown on that plot of land to get a GHG profile for unit, whatever the unit of measure is that it was purchased in on, and the water. So they're doing a bang up job of getting new business because everybody wants to use their database. So, but scope 3 right now is mandatory and it is a very, very difficult. And so there's a lot of there's a lot of tension right now in the business community about this. And those who aren't experiencing that havoc means they're probably asleep or just completely stupid. They don't know when the freight train's going to run them over. So again, just a quick review. You have scopes 1, 2, 3. 3 has 2 parts, upstream, downstream. And I think most companies going to have less trouble with the upstream part of 3 than the downstream, because now they're going to actually have to do an evaluation of the energy efficiency of their products and the water efficiency of their products, and whether they made them, whether they designed them to be disassembled or repurposed or not. So any questions before we move on? By the way, I've hyperlinked all of this. You can get these manuals, or the better approach is to go to our curated website. And so when you look at anything with the GHG standard documents are listed, you'll also see all these other great things surrounding it that you'll find useful, you know, for the carbon cycle documents, etc. And as Sandy explained earlier, understanding the difference between a natural GHG cycle, carbon cycle, and an artificial one, which is the one that we've created. And by the way, it's so interesting that I'm in California and it's been dry. So many people in the community we live in, they've gone into cactus and they've gone into succulents, so they don't have to use very much water. And I said, well, I wonder whether cactus really is. And I've been a cactus fan. I used to collect cactus, all kinds of exotic stuff way back when. But cactus itself is one of the few plants that does not emit the stored carbon in its roots when it dies. When a cactus is dying, it excretes a solution that encases its root system. And so when it dies, it's actually and it's actually in storage in this encased substance, which is kind of cool. But at any rate, so you'll find all kinds of interesting things in the curated section. So when you see a hyperlink, it'll take you right out there when you get the PDF. And there's one other standard that they're working on for ag. It's called FLAG. It's forests, forest land, and agriculture. And I've forgotten what the G means, or I've forgotten, but anyway. So they are the standards setter. They're the foundational piece. The GHG protocol is the foundational piece for everything that deals with emissions. Now, on our website, there's two webinars on, one is on scopes 1 and 2, and one is on scopes 3. And so just go to that hot link, or just go to the recording link on our website, and you'll see it there. And by the way, access to the website it's open 24/7, free, there's no charge. Next, let's move. Any questions? How are we doing for time? We're pretty good. If there's no questions, I'll move into the water footprint network, which is the assessment itself. And I'll give you a story about when I first became aware of it. And this was a real big deal because it was the first science-based approach to water management. You'll see the differentiation shortly between old school traditional methods in this. And it had quite a community associated with it that really wanted all this research and all these this methodology applied and understood. And for whatever reason, and I think I have a reason, but it's speculative, it's widely used in the EU, but not really well known in the US. But we'll talk about that at the end of the presentation on all of this. First of all, just a good starter about the importance of water. First of all, you can live for decades after being exposed to air pollution. In Southern California, everybody knows about air pollution. We have our Air Resources Board. They're the ones that have written standards that other states have emulated, et cetera. We're the only state that can make its own environmental laws related to air quality. And you can see that I have it hyperlinked because the hyperlink came after I put this down as an issue, because a new study came out and said pollution definitely causes, in this case, it's caused over the last century, millions and millions of people to die. They just live longer and they're bad health, and the thing that finally pushes them into death has been pollution, accumulated pollution. So my saying you can live for decades exposed to air pollution is still not a good situation, implies that, hey, it's just you're going to be slightly compromised. Guess what? That's not necessarily the case. The second point is that we can live in an artificially cooled environment for a long time. That works great, because we have heat cycles that are going to be tremendous in the future. They're occurring right now, but they're going to get even worse. But humidity is very important. The ideal level of humidity for your lungs and your well-being is probably around 45% humidity. And anyone who's living in the San Diego area or in California, we get Santa Ana winds, and we'll get moisture levels down to 15%. So living in an artificially cooled environment is better than sweating and dying of heat prostration or heat exposure. But nevertheless, it's not good for you over the long term. You can live for 8 to 21 days without food. It may not be very pleasant. I tried fasting for health reasons some years back, and 1 day, 2 days, you're okay. But beyond that, it's not very good. There's a point where your body starts eating itself. It's eating your fat stores, etc. So you can live without food from 8 to 21 days, but the one that is really stands out is you can only live without water for about 3 days. We're basically a bunch of water, with containers. Our body's a big container with all kinds of systems running inside of it that all requires water. So water, and when I say water, I'm talking blue water. And blue water means it's drinkable water, typically found in aquifers, lakes, rivers, reservoirs, ponds, etc. It can be with some processing, sanitized and usable for drinking without being sick. So blue water is there because, well, there are different water types. And I always think of California when I first moved here, the old Western movies, and there's the desert and the pioneers, and you would see pictures of cattle and they didn't have water and they died. But it, again, despite all the torrential rain we have, I don't think our water supply is as good as we would like to think it is, because we built systems that depend on snow melt, and now it's warmed enough. We don't get as much snow, we get more rain, and we don't haven't done a good job of rain capture. We still will go through drought cycles. Okay, these are estimates from reputable sources. WRI, and the very first one there, is the owner of the GHG protocol. They're highly respected, World Resources Institute. And their assessment is that 50% of the global usable water will be consumed by 2030. Basically, we have not allowed any replenishment to take place. We've consumed more and more on an ongoing basis over decades, and particularly aquifers in key agricultural areas. For example, the Central Valley of California. And that's not the only one. It's going on in Mexico and everywhere. And you go into Spain and the south of Spain, they have the same issues. The whole Mediterranean issue has the same issue. Water stress will impact 50% of the global population by 2030. And that's from the UN environmental program. That's directly an organization nested within the UN. And when you think about Southwestern USA, water has always been, gold. It's always been gold, but taken granted because we've built nice architected systems, engineered systems to bring water to where it really shouldn't, there's not enough there to support the population. One thing that I did way back when is I looked up the population just before the Department of Water and Power in LA did a sneaky deal and literally stole all the water from the Owens Valley. I looked at the population of Los Angeles, the city itself, and it was in the surrounding suburbs. It was 100,000 people. At the time they were tapping water. So I take that as the natural level of population for the organic, normal, or local water supply. So we greatly exceeded that. So the southwestern US has always been water poor. There is a real strong connection between food, electricity, and water. Many of the things that are necessary for food, beyond just water, water is understood, requires electricity to, in fact, create fertilizers and create pesticides and etc. All that, and the equipment today. So there is a really dynamic there where they're intertwined very significantly. And then one other issue is that a lot of the migration issues we're seeing in particularly Europe is going crazy right now, and we're going crazy in the US is migration. People are suffering from, food sufficiency isn't there necessarily everywhere. There are parts of the world where they're really parched, and people are trying to move somewhere else. So, and there's water wars going on all over the place. And sometimes those are actually couched in very polite terms, and because they're not localized for us, there's too much to take in. We ignore that. In fact, I had an interesting situation. I was working with a food company, and they were doing both non-kosher and kosher food at the same time. and that required a rabbi. And I'm not Jewish, so I didn't know about all the rabbinical laws and all that stuff. And I talked about the way that they had to sanitize things, which was very water intensive. And one day the rabbi became comfortable with me being around, and he talked about that one of the real reasons for the tension in the Middle East, not the only reason, was actually this dispute over water. It was all these countries really battling for scarce resource called water. Okay, moving on before we get into the guts of the water footprint assessment tool, the methodology, the science. Any questions? Any thoughts? Okay. Boy, you're going to make me hoarse here. You're not giving me any breather. Um, it's conceptually similar to the SCORE reference model. And you'll see in my diagram, they're very, the SCORE and the GHG protocol and the water foot assessment, really, in my mind, they kind of link together is if you can get how, for example, the inheritance thing, where as it moves along in the process of being converted into something, it generates more GHG emissions and it consumes more water. That's really shared. And the length of how you define a reasonable supply chain, how far it travels, is all shared. It's relatively new to North America and is very usable and and it's evolving. And an unfortunate incident occurred where the key person driving it at a university in the Netherlands died early in life, and he was the dynamic behind it. So mostly now the methodology exists, but the organization that created it is only focused on research, and we don't have any champions in North America for it. So people know about it. All the beverage companies know, the big names, and anybody who uses a lot of water knows about it in North America, but they're not talking about it. But at any rate, it's very important that we talk about it and we understand it. It's supported by global government agencies. EU, for example, typically goes to this water footprint network. That's the name of that's been applied to it. It operates out of a university in the Netherlands. And it's multi-phased. It deals with water assessment, the accounting of it, and the sustainability aspects of it. And it's really, it's very precise. Anytime you see conversion tables and algorithms and all that stuff, they way back when they had their one leader leading the charge, they did have available online education. They haven't been able to keep up with that. They're doing peer research now. But anytime you have all that stuff worked out, then you've got something that can be implemented. It's very flexible, and you'll see there's trade-offs that have to be made. And at the end of this, I'll actually shift away from the actual assessment and talking about its logic into situations where you will, well, anyway, you'll see. Here's the traditional method. We, up until this point, and in some places still, in fact, most places still, only talk about withdrawal, meaning if I'm in Oceanside or in any town, or even in my household, we always think about what we use. We don't, in water that is used directly, it's also always direct use. So when I get a bill for water, it's for direct use. When the county or the city or whatever it is that is the governing organization, they look at things. They look at the withdrawal of blue water. That's about it. That's one of the things that drive them. Now, in the water footprint assessment tool, they have not only a direct water footprint method classification, they have an indirect classification. For example, they make a distinction between, in the direct use, green water. That is water that falls out of the sky. We'll use an ag situation. It's on a farm, it's falling out of the sky. It hits the soil. The water replenishes the water content of the plants, but no significant amount makes it into any catchment, be it a river, lake, aquifer, etc. So that's green water footprint. That really is just the normal organic cycles. And, you're not importing things, you're not whatever. The blue water footprint is the water that is in again, the aquifers, the reservoirs, the lakes, the streams, the ponds, whatever. And then the gray water is the polluted water, a byproduct of doing things. One of the most polluting processes that has taken place was actually electricity being generated by coal. You get all this byproduct, and often would find its way into rivers, that would find its way into all kinds of stuff, and the pollution was terrible. And so whenever they have pollution today in many areas where they have strict controls, they will dilute the polluted water with good water to bring it down to a level where they can then let it go into the downstreams and into the oceans, etc. So the breakthrough logic that occurs and is in the methodology is here in the indirect water footprint. And basically, the one that counts most for us really today in this discussion is the blue water footprint. And again, this is the inheritance thing. It's the amount of water that has cumulatively been expended as something moves, a product or a service move through its cycle until it gets to a completed state. And then you have that ledger of all that accumulated stuff sitting there. And the ledger is a lot bigger than you would think. And by the way, this is that champion who is this charismatic, very super smart guy, Aaron Hoekstra. When he died, he was at the point where he was trying to not commercialize it for profit's sake. He was trying to bring it out of kind of an academic standing or something applicable for very, very large companies or governments, etc. He wanted to productize the whole thing so it would become as widespread used as, for example, the GHG protocol. Okay, here's one example that he developed, and it's quite complicated, really, in many ways. And when I first looked at that, I asked them. I've had access to talking to we've had, in fact, one of their scientists and one of their consultants speak about the footprint network and the assessment, and you can find it. It's a recorded webinar. It was live out of Amsterdam. It's on our website. So when Sandy goes through the curated section, giving you a tour at the end of today, then we'll you can see it there. I've asked, what is this? Because we're talking about accumulate, and he goes, well, before you could grow the cotton plant, you had to have seed. Before you had the seed that you would use to grow that, you had to have, a plant to create the seed. So you had to water it and fertilize it. So you had GHG emissions and you had water use. So before we even had the cotton plant, it carried a profile that's not even incorporated in this diagram necessarily, because they would make it, kind of silly, too complicated. But they go through the whole process of the plant. You harvest it, the seed is extracted. You have two byproducts really, and it becomes two of them. In fact, becomes a number of them. The cotton seed has a very distinct path, and the cotton lint has a very distinct path. But throughout every single one of these processes, okay, all of this and all of this and all of this down there, water is being consumed. In fact, a cotton shirt, despite the fact that it is, organic and nice, is very water intense. But again, people way back when, or until now, people who buy a cotton shirt, they'll keep it for a long, long period of time. So, in fact, when we get to the very end on Tuesday, and the end of the whole course, we'll talk about the ridiculous level of waste we have today, and actually quantify that so people can see how disastrous it is. But anyway, this whole process is very elaborate, and water is being used at every single step. And that cotton shirt represents gallons and gallons and gallons of water. In fact, here's an analysis they did out of the network. And by the way, objects are not the scale. I want to make that because we're not going to drive a car that small, but they just looked at a small car and just the steel for a car and the water that was used in all the steps from mining all the way up to the car being delivered to consumer. It was 80,000 gallons. This doesn't count the rubber. It doesn't count the plastic. Okay. This is just, it doesn't count the aluminum. It counts the steel. Okay. So that 80,000 gallons. Here's a beer. I guess is our brewery person with us today? Yeah.
Oh, she's not.
She's not. Okay. So it's 79 gallons for a beer. At least, at least you get the benefit if you feel mellow after a beer. So maybe there is a benefit there, but that's still a lot. And most people would not think that's 79 gallons, but it is. And the final one is the hamburger, and that's 634 gallons, one hamburger. I guess it's a quarter pounder, half pounder, or whatever it is. But you can what you see there is it's kind of hidden. We don't think about it, but this bun is a bread is wheat, a wheat is plants, water them, etc. And you have to do all that nonsense. Not nonsense, but all that stuff. I hate watering. That's why I like cactus. The big component here is the meat, because before you can render a cow into protein or for as a food, it has to grow to a substantial size. It's eating a lot of grain, which is again all water stored in that grain as a water ledger. And by the time it's all done, it gets to be an immense amount of water, 634 gallons. So if you went out and had a lunch, you would be consuming indirectly, not quite, let's say 725 gallons of water, indirect. Now, if you're living in a water intensive area, that's okay, but a good portion of the world isn't, and people are still eating this way. This is why some of it, people are on this vegetarian kick saying, if you're a vegetarian, you don't consume as much. And if you notice the price of steak, for example, right now, and any meat, and that's a reasonable quality, it's actually astronomical because it's starting to reflect the true costs of producing that protein. So getting a little further into it, one of the things that's really quite important in the assessment tool is that the methodology itself looks at where something is geographically sourced. They're on all the incoming materials, where the beginning is, where the cotton is grown, for example. It also looks at that particular patch where that cotton is grown, because we have many different places that grow cotton or any commodity. It's historical seasonal patterns. Does it have wet spells and dry spells? How long is the dry spells? And right now we know in the Southwest, we're predicting we'll get through this wet spell and then we'll have a very long dry spell. But that's occurring in all around the Mediterranean, all the countries bordering and as part of the Mediterranean, they're having that issue. They're having drought issues. They're having drought issues in Germany. You name it, there's drought everywhere. They're having water crisis problems in China. They're trying to take water from, I don't know, I'm sure if it's the north and actually do engineering a big conduit system, much like we have in California. I see them going south to north or north to south, I forget. So you have to consider seasonal patterns of, does it make sense to grow something there in this specific area? It's all science-based, and they understand hotspots. That's what they're concerned about in this, because there are examples of the wrong crop being grown in an area and depleting water sources and creating havoc on the local economy and health issues. And here's a good example coming up. And by the way, there's standard calculations, as I mentioned earlier, available for everything within the water footprint network. Here's the example about understanding the ecological requirements of a water source, be it a lake, an aquifer, a river, you name it. If you look at this, the upper left going horizontally, or vertically rather, that is the measurement of water level. And the light blue up here is the environmental flow requirement. That's where it's healthy. The darker area below it is where it is not healthy. It starts to die. All the life within that water source is dying. And down at the very bottom, going from left to right, you have the months of the year. And in this case, you can see that between beginning in April and ending in September, this water source, it is in jeopardy. Most of the life within that water source is starting to die off. It's no longer, it's in crisis mode. And there are many examples going on right now that we don't know about, but I'll give you an example shortly. So they are very concerned about that, and they do the analytics to help countries understand that. I know the EU hires the team at the Water Footprint Network in the Netherlands on a regular basis to go consult on this kind of issues. Here's an example of an Aral Sea, which was a freshwater sea. Its main industry was fishing. It had a nice economy. The country that it resided in is formerly part of the Soviet Union. Decided they wanted to get into cotton. And so what they did is they shifted emphasis away from fishing, the production of cotton, and they literally drained the lake, the sea. It's just a big lake. They called it a sea. As a byproduct, the fishing economy was killed as a byproduct. They were pariahs because of what happened. So the cotton, if they had any cotton at all, they didn't have a water source now to feed it. They weren't viewed very favorably in the world. And ironically, I presented part of this just on water when I was on the Apex board of directors way back when. I'm talking about the corporate board. And we had one individual who came from Russia, and he said, for that specific situation that you're using, there's a crisis beyond the loss of employment and loss of an environment that's nice to live with. People are getting, there's actually a plague or an epidemic of cancers. Because with water, the great thing about water is if you have any kind of contaminants, even if they're natural, it's like arsenic. There's a lot of arsenic in certain nuts and fruits, depending on but it's benign because it's so small. But when that sea was diminished down to its seabed and dried out, all those contaminants were concentrated. And now when winds would ripple over formerly the water, now they're going over this contaminated seabed and it's blowing dust into the communities that still surround that's former sea. So this is where preserving and using water appropriately is important. You just cannot, you have to look at the trade-offs, what you're going to get. Again, it has this geographical perspective. It's the same as with SCORE. In the case of SCORE, now materials I studied SCORE 15 years ago almost. And at the time, everything was in a book, so I threw away everything after the course was over because it was too much to carry around, and I had everything in my head by and large. But they always viewed the length of the supply chain as being a big issue. And it is because you have all this risk. The more complicated the supply chain, the more the risk. But the water footprint network also is concerned about where something comes from, really. What water source was tapped into a product that's being used somewhere else? And so I'm using their diagram to show that not only for the water footprint network, but for SCORE. In the water footprint network, the real issue is that uh, regions often that are water poor are creating products and selling them to water-rich countries who are not using their natural assets correctly, and they're burdening the countries that need that revenue and are giving up something that's essential for life. One ironic thing is that I lived in the UK and my wife's English, and boy, the UK, it's always raining. You always see someone with their umbrella. The UK imports more water in the products that they use every day from outside the country than they actually consume water from inside the country. So, and I don't know what the profile is for the US. I probably should look that up. Okay. Now, I would run normally an exercise here, but I don't want to run too far over the session tonight. But with the GHG protocol, I think the first thing I look at is that what are the benefits side and what does it do? What are the benefits side? Well, actually, let me bring up everything at one time and just make it a little bit easier. And you can see that there is kind of there's a simpatico there between them all. For example, starting with SCORE, you're dealing with supply chain discovery. You have an opportunity for benchmarking. You're looking at supply chain efficiency. You're looking at visibility, risk management. In fact, many disproportionate number of SCORE implementations really were centered around trying to identify risk management. You can incorporate sustainability into it, which occurred back around 2010. I think they put the GRI stuff in there, and my fellow team member on our SIG, Taylor Wilkerson, he was the author of that. And you can actually do transition planning, and we're talking about all the things that's going to be touched by the transition to away from a fossil fuel economy. You can see just about everything's going to be touched. And so SCORE will play a big role in looking at it and seeing it and understanding it. And on the right-hand side, it's all the benefits: improved profit, risk management, reliability. I should say also with the reliability, agility. The agility part is really in SCORE is when something bad happens, you've anticipated but don't know what really is the probable cause. It could be any one of a number of things, but you have a contingency plan to allow you to survive. It's like in Southern California with fires, it's grab your red bag. Under my desk, I have a red bag. It has enough for me to survive for 2 or 3 days. My wife has a red bag. We have water, key documents, food, a little bit of money, etc. So you always have to have that buffer and to give you agility. And it has to be worked out where it really makes sense. So all these things are, again, a key part of the benefit side of SCORE. And it's really managing the transition, the managed transition. It allows that. You get to the GHG protocol, you get the end-to-end accounting, carbon accounting. You can do your reduction planning as a result of it. They have rules, and it's called the project side. Remember, I showed you that document with a hot link. They get into the project side. Supply chain collaboration, because your profile reflects your suppliers, be it scope 2 suppliers or scope 3 suppliers, and product lifecycle planning. It allows you to get into all of that because of now you're being measured. That's another big measurement that perhaps might even be more larger than many other performance measures that companies have to apply. This cost reduction, risk management, reputation management, innovation is a big deal because, finding alternatives and coming up with collaborations requires innovations. And again, managed transition. The water is pretty much the same. I think the one thing that where I have a big question mark, and I think I'm going to take that off soon. Everywhere, water, the cost of water is going to go up. It's still the most abused commodity that we have, and it's underpriced. And water, the water supply everywhere, because we're now having to do um, uh, RO processing of wastewater. They're doing it now in Oceanside. They're going to they will have enough water that is wastewater that has been processed through RO, reverse osmosis, and then pump it back into aquifers in, in a purified, hopefully in a purified state. And desalination is very expensive. By the way, RO is very energy intensive. So you can see where there's trade-off, where I said this, food, water, energy thing, it's all kind of intertwined. But I think cost will go up rather dramatically. The issue here was that in Arizona, which has had a water shortage so severe that people who were bought homes and paid for those homes eventually were told that they no longer had access to water by the local water authority. That's how severe it was in certain communities. They, in some cases, imported water by truck. And eventually, many of the trucking companies said, we've been denied water that is being used outside of the city or the entity, be it county, that we were drawing it from. And at the same time, there was a very large farm making alfalfa, and it was acres after acres, and the amount of water draw per day was in the millions of gallons. The customer for that was in the Middle East, in a very rich country, and the alfalfa or the hay was for their horses and livestock. So here was a ranch that signed a contract, or a farm that signed a contract to grow a crop to feed the horses of someone halfway around the world. And that just seemed to be a disaster, not on par with what happened in the former Soviet Union with their freshwater sea, but was equally, it was very damaging. So I wanted to use that as an example of how ridiculous some things that are going on today. Now, it so happened this was on a public network, TV broadcasting this event, and eventually so much pressure was put on it that they were denied the right to continue with that contract, to void that contract and stop that. So here was a place that was water poor down to the point where someone couldn't go take a shower, didn't have water, had purchased a home, and it was more widespread than this one video or circumstance would suggest. So that just strikes me as being ridiculous. It's very poor blue water stewardship of something very valuable. And if they want to keep horses in Saudi Arabia, that's fine. But you grow your own alpha. Take it from water stressed, water poor place. And by the way, Arizona and California and all the others that use the Colorado River, we're going to be in arguments forever about who gets, some of that river, that very diminished river in the future. So the Southwest is water poor. So this is a bad use of a resource. It's inappropriate. The alfalfa probably should have been grown, if you want to sell it to them, in somewhere where the crop can be nurtured and grown with green water, stuff just out of the sky, and you're not tapping in aquifers, you're not stealing it for a better purpose. I don't know if I made sense, but it just struck me as being a bit outrageous. So, and I'll get you the link before the meeting is over. I'll put it in the chat box. Does that make sense? Or am I being too demanding? Here they have no water, and someone is in that same area. They're to sell hay for someone's horses in the Middle East. They're using up millions of gallons of water a day. So I don't remember the actual number. They mentioned it in the whole thing. It was on the news. This would be inappropriate use of water, aggravating a bad water situation. You have what you do, the crops you grow, and how you do business, and it has to be really alignment with what you are rich in. You've got to be reasonable about stuff. And even when we go up to California and the Central Valley, yes, it is kind of in the winter, people are eating stuff from the Central Valley, and that's great, but you have to adjust your water use and grow the correct crops that aren't water intensive. When there's an almond farmer who there has been put under pressure because almonds are really water intensive to grow, and he's defending it with his right to making a profit. I've got this thing, it makes a profit. It's my right to use water from the aquifer, and because I make so much money on almonds, I can dig deeper and deeper wells, and and the aquifer is in fact being depleted to the point it's so severe that there's been subsidence of the land where roads have fallen 20, 30 feet. The road itself has just collapsed because of no water to keep the crust of the earth holding it up. So anyway, I will get that to you, and I apologize. I'll have to figure out what I need to do. But I've run this before, but I always had sound, and I don't know what I did wrong. But I'd like to move on. Anybody comments about that? I know it may sound to be a bit too civic oriented, but you don't want to move a factory or build a factory that requires, and the products you're making is very water intensive. You don't want to do that. It just won't work. Now, there are certain countries where they have made the choice. For example, chip manufacturing is very water intensive, computer chip manufacturing. In Taiwan, they have elected to take out of service a large amount of acreage that was farmed. So they've just said, okay, we're going to give up the revenue, and we have enough food, but we're going to give up the revenue from food that we may export, but we're going to allocate that water now to making chips. And on a positive side, the design of the chip factories that they're building are attempting to be as water frugal as possible and recycle lots of it, because chip manufacturing requires extremely pure water. So the use of a scarce resource has to be taken into consideration. So any thoughts or comments? Getting near the end here. Here's one that I found interesting, that there's this big push to go to hydrogen, green hydrogen, and I have no problem with it if in fact it is reasonable. But because I'm thinking water scarcity, and where would I, with water scarcity, what kind of profile does hydrogen have? And is it appropriate to be, for example, be produced in the Southwest? So the very first part of that is that I'm taking, and again, this is just my math, and I've researched this, and I might be slightly wrong in certain areas, but I don't think I've taken the most conservative estimate possible. But let's just say I want to make 1 gallon of hydrogen. So the water that I need to do that is um, it's quite a big number. It takes 80 gallons of water from my local municipality, stuff that they ask us to drink out of the tap. But because it requires cleaner water than normal, I probably need to run that through reverse osmosis, RO, the process where I'm filtering it. Same one they're using for desalination to get water, same one they're using to get with UV light, the same one that they are using for polluted water. They're reusing it. They're doing it through RO and UV light to kill stuff, kill the dangerous viruses and whatever else there. So the yield of that process is roughly 20 gallons out of 80. And then it goes through the process, both the actual electricity being thrown into that batch of 20 gallons. And there's also some things that need to take place for cooling, etc. So that really is consuming a lot of water. It just goes away. But the energy to use that is 189 roughly kilowatt hours. Now, to put that in perspective, the max limit on tier 1 electricity costs for a consumer in California per month, per household, for a household is around a little over 340 kWh per month. So I'm taking the equivalent of the energy for half a month for a household. Let's say it has 3 or 4 people living in a household. Okay, that much energy. And the actual yield from all of that is 1 gallon of hydrogen. So does that make sense? Now, just throw this out. I'd really like to have some comments. Does that make sense to do that? Would that make sense anywhere in California to do that right now, or Arizona, or Nevada, or New Mexico? Comments?
Yeah, I have a question. From my old chemistry days, when you have a container of a gas, you want to know what its concentration is. Do you have any information on the concentration or the molarity of that H2 gas?
No,
That's
what I
really
did is I was looking at, because water is always in gallons or liters or whatever. I
Mhm.
started out in my research looking at strictly, I want the conversion into gallons, wherever it is, how many gallons is it? And so I kept it at gallons. As a gas, I'm not sure how much it really
It
would
would be
convert.
helpful to know, how many atmospheres of pressure, for example. That's one way to look at it.
Right.
If it's 1 atmosphere of pressure, in a gallon of hydrogen gas, that's not very much.
Hmm. The,
So
yeah,
we can research that later.
right. But the point here I'm trying to make is that when I do this preliminary math, it tells me that this is something I need to do far more research on before I commit to permitting a plant to be built, or attempting to finance a plant to be built to make hydrogen in Southwest because of water issues. Now fracking uses a tremendous amount of water, and I'm not quite sure. I didn't redo research, but my point here is I was saying there's the right place to make certain products if they're water intensive. And in the Southwest US may not be that place. Because when you take 80 gallons of something, and by the time the processing is all done, it consumes, it gets down to 1 gallon. And then you take the electricity amount that it took to make this batch. And it was, half of what a household uses in over 2 weeks to live with, to turn on everything in his household. And for the most part, we're very electrified. So it was an issue.
Europe is facing the worst drop.
Pardon?
Sorry, that was me. Adeline sent everyone a link and I clicked on it and it started playing and I couldn't turn it off.
Oh,
So
okay.
thank you, Adeline.
Yeah.
Well, we'll look at it later.
Okay. Let me move then to, well, here's the little, asterisk-like comments where this was the cooling, that was part of the process. And also SDG and E, its rates. Tier 1 is up to 382 kWh per household per month. So those are the limits. Just put in perspective. And I do know, one of the things that when we had the salination plant built in Carlsbad, I was hoping that they would put photovoltaic up, but there's no photovoltaic. So, the energy it's going to take to actually run that RO thing is probably a best kept secret. It's probably very high, the amount of electrical energy. So, but again, I'm just trying to let everybody understand that there's a trade-off, and investigations need to be made, particularly in an era where we still has some residual greenwashing going on. And there's also one called gaslighting, and we'll talk about that in the final session on Tuesday, where there's actually a concerted attempt to actually brainwash, this is my way of expressing it, people, so that they actually overlook what's really going on. So, but anyway, here's a case where I say, okay, this may not make sense. I need to further investigate. Now, let me go into one where it's okay. I want to make green steel. And there is a differentiation in steel. They have grades. And so, to make this, making steel, there's a tremendous amount of energy required to make it. And there's a tremendous amount of, if you want, you need hydrogen to make the steel, because it's going to do all the equivalent of electrification. So it's H2 green steel, and I hyperlinked all that, is the world's first large-scale green steel plant. And it's been funded at this point, with 6.5 billion, and they have secured a long-term renewable power purchase agreements, and its location is in northern Sweden. Okay. Now, I lived in Sweden, and when you get to the midpoint of Sweden and you go north, it is granite, forest, water everywhere. It's sparsely populated. It's not good for, in fact, growing crops. All the food in Sweden, by and large, that is vegetable in nature, is grown in the southern part, which gets to be flat land, less granite, etc. The lakes that it has, it's almost 100,000 lakes, 9,000, what? Almost 96,000 lakes, almost 96,000 lakes. Now, the energy that they're purchasing is all green. It's from a Finnish company. And it has roughly the same number of lakes. And so they're very water rich. And to show you where it's being produced in the very tip of Sweden. And I've been up in that very direction near the Arctic Circle. I've been up there. It's right near the Arctic Circle. It's like 50, 60 miles away from the Arctic Circle. So it seems to me that this is a place that has the profile of being ideal for making steel using hydrogen, making green hydrogen rather. So I just use that as a contrast between the two. Yes, this fits the profile, and maybe the Southwest US does not.
So this is what our website looks like. And I've sent the link out last time. I think I sent it again at the beginning of today's session. It's sandiego.amcs.org. And you go to that website and you click on eco sustainability, this drop down menu here, and that takes you to this page, eco-sustainability. Preston, we need to do something about this
I know,
link here.
I know, yeah.
This takes you, if you click, if you're really, really excited to go to the curated section, you can click right here without going any further. But the main page here is an introduction to the SIG, why we're doing this, what's important, there's 4 reasons why we're doing this, and then all of the organizations that we're associated with and that we quote and publish quite often. SCORE, GHG Protocol, Water Footprint, we talked about today. There's IPCC, SASB, TCFD, GRI, LEED, and the circular economy, which we'll cover next week, I believe. And we have events every so often. And we have sponsors down here, not monetary sponsors, but associations that we work with. Along the right, we have upcoming events. We have an overview. This is actually what we're doing right now. Then later in the month, we have certified ESG training. And then we have recordings of all of the past webinars that we've done for the past 2+ years since we've been doing this. Going back to the top in the pull down menu, go to the events, and we have there's a certified training coming up. There's also the recordings available on this page. Keep going. You go to the bios. This is us. This is the advisory board that is responsible for the eco-sustainability SIG. Here's me and Preston and a few other folks. And we've added Annie. Annie's our newest member. She's a recent graduate from, I can't remember, I think UCSD. Nick Lund is also relatively new. He's from USD. So you can click on our pictures and read our bios. And finally, here's the curated section. And this is split off into about 9 different sections: blue water, circular economy, education and consulting resources, ESG, GHG, global reporting, green biz, greenhouse gases, SCORE, actually more than 9 categories, sustainability planning, and here we have the UN SDGs. Some of the things I highlighted earlier, you click on one of the pictures, it takes you to a list of the documents that we have in there. And I think I sent everyone else today the SCORE Digital Standard Quick Reference Guide. That's right here, for example. And there's other information about SCORE.
Mhm.
I can also go to greenhouse gas emissions and a lot of articles here. In particular, there's some that I mentioned early on, the carbon cycle. DOE explains the carbon cycle, geochemical cycles. So this gets into some of the biochemistry of greenhouse gases, CO2 and methane in particular. And I'll let you all click around. You go to ESG. A lot of companies are publishing ESG and sustainability reports, and we have a few in here from Caterpillar, Tosca. Now I can't see them. There's one from Pepsi, Ernst & Young. It's one from CGI, the company I retired from, and a few others, and Amazon. So and here's the Pepsi one. So it's good reading to see what are companies doing to try to meet the sustainability challenges. Well, that's about it. There's the webinar recordings page. Everything that we've ever done is available here. Just go here and click on it. And then what's left. And if you want to join us, click here. And you want to learn more, you want to join our little club and contribute to what we're doing, we'd be happy to have you. Just let us know. Goodbye, everybody. Have a
Goodbye.
good Super Bowl weekend. We'll see you on Tuesday.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.